Today we're going to kind of taking it in a new direction. Last 5 weeks or so, 6 weeks, we've been looking at Europe largely and the Western world and looking at their history. And this period is known as as we saw, was the early modern period when you talk about European history from 1500. And the early modern period, you know, was the first these couple of centuries from the 16th through the mid 18th century in European history. Now, when you look at Asia, and you look at what's going on in Asia, a term that is often used by historians is to refer to this period as late traditional Asia, late traditional China, late traditional Japan. And the reason why they use the phrase late traditional is because in this particular part of the world, and especially in East Asia, like in places like China, the focus in this period was on preserving and maintaining ancient traditions stretching back centuries. So we saw that when we looked at Europe, that Europe was undergoing tremendous radical change with the Reformation and the Renaissance and ancient discovery. So and the modern world was beginning to take shape. But when you go back and look at Asia in this period, they were kind of focusing primarily on their ancient traditions and their past and preserving and maintaining those traditions. And a lot of it had to do with the fact, one reason why China was so traditional, and the same was true of much of Asia, was because, you know the old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you look at the history of Asia, they had experienced centuries of stability and order and peace and prosperity, and really saw no real need to change systems that had been working successfully for so long. So that is the reason primarily why there was this focus on preserving and maintaining tradition. It had always worked in the past. You know, if you were to look and compare Asia to Europe in 1500, let's say, going back 500 years, you find that Europe was a backwater. You know, lower population, less trade, diseased, very much on the margins. Whereas if you were to look at China and Japan and Asia in general, you'd find huge cities and flourishing trade and a much more dynamic economy. So, and you could say that in Asia, one reason why there was no impetus to have sweeping change was because everything had gone so well and looked like everything was going to continue in that direction. So why change course when things are going so well? And Asia was by far the richer part of the globe 500 years ago, if you go back in time. All right, so today we're going to be looking at some of these great civilizations of Asia. We're going to start with China, we're going to go to Japan, and then, if we have time, we're going to look at Central Asia, India, and Iran. So we're going to cover all of basically Asia, and we probably won't finish them all today, but whatever we don't finish today, we will finish on Tuesday. All right, so let's look at China first. Now, talking about stability, you know, if you look at Chinese history, Chinese history is organized by dynasties, by families of Chinese emperors. That's what a dynasty is, a family of rulers. You know, we talked about the Habsburg dynasty. Well, and when we talk about European history, well, in China, from 1368 to 1911, what is that? That's like 500 plus years, or whatever. My math's not so good, but anyway. But for that long period of time, China was ruled by two dynasties. The Ming dynasty, which begins 1368 to 1644, and the Manchu dynasty, 1644 to 1911. So these two dynasties took Chinese history all the way up until the beginning of the 20th century. So see if I can get these maps to work. So here's the Ming China. So here's Korea, here's China, here's India, Russia would be up here. So that's that. And then the Manchu dynasty or the Qing or Qing dynasty is a bit larger. You see that it includes a big chunk of areas in the western part of, and actually the Manchu dynasty is roughly equivalent to modern China. So the borders of the Manchu Empire basically became the borders of China in the 21st century. All right, so let's talk about these two dynasties. The Ming dynasty was founded by a man by the name of Hong Wu, and you can see his picture here. There he is. Who was Hong Wu? It's a great story. He was a peasant orphan, believe it or not, and he was actually raised by Buddhist monks, and they were Buddhist monks that followed the White Lotus Goddess. You see, in Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism that was practiced in China, the idea is that there's a certain bodhisattva, a certain deity where you focus your worship on. You're especially dedicated, and the idea is that bodhisattva, that goddess or god, will bring you to higher consciousness. That you'll experience a better life because that particular Buddhist deity is watching over you. So if you are dedicated to that deity, you will have peace and enjoy prosperity and all that. And these particular Buddhists were loyal to this particular goddess, this White Lotus Goddess. Now, the thing about Buddhism in China was that this Mahayana Buddhism often incorporated local cults and religious traditions into the Buddhist kind of matrix. So in this case, the White Lotus Goddess was a local Chinese goddess that when Buddhism was brought to China back probably in the 4th and 5th century AD, this local religion was kind of swept into the worship and the teachings of the Buddha and Buddhism. So you had these monks who were especially loyal to the White Lotus Goddess, and they were raising Hong Wu. Now, it so happened in China that when this is repeatedly in the history of China, you see this happening, where people who belong to a certain religious cult, that cult or that religion, not necessarily a cult has a bad meaning, but that particular sect, let's say, becomes the focus of political intrigue. And a lot of times when the Chinese are upset with the government, a lot of times they'll form a religious sect or organization that has a political objective. And this has happened a lot in Chinese history. Now, it so happened that the White Lotus Buddhists became organized around overthrowing and opposing the Mongol dynasty. Back in the 13th century, the Mongols, a foreign people, had conquered China and set up a family of rulers, the family of Kublai Khan. And they ruled over China. Now, the Mongols were, by the 14th century, Mongol rule had become very unpopular. The Mongols, they monopolized all the more important positions in government, and the Mongols themselves often were quarreling among themselves. And so the government of the Mongols was perceived as weak and divided. And the White Lotus sect became critical of the Mongol dynasty and became a focal point of opposition to the Mongols. And Hong Wu, when he became an adult, became the leader of this White Lotus sect. And he became involved in efforts to overthrow the Mongol dynasty. Now, he formed an alliance with another religious group that was opposed to the Mongols. They were called the Red Turbans. The Red Turbans, and probably because they wore red turbans. I'm just guessing here. I'm not an expert in Chinese history, but these red turbans were interesting. They were actually Manichaean Christians. Christianity had actually, a form of Christianity had made its way to China, probably by the 5th, 6th century AD, and the Manichaeans were what compared to Orthodox Christianity or regular Christianity, they're a sect. They believe that the devil created the world, for example. They had some interesting ideas, but anyway, these red turban were Chinese Manichaean Christians. And they, what happened is that Hong Wu married the daughter of the leader of the Red Turbans, and they formed an alliance. And eventually, in 1368, they marched on Beijing, the capital of China, and defeated the Mongols. And the Mongols left the country, just packed their bags and got out and went back to Mongolia. And Hong Wu now became the Emperor of China. So he went from peasant orphan to Emperor of China. Now, the thing about Hong Wu was that he was a realist. You know, he had been raised by Buddhist monks. He'd formed alliance with Manichaean Chinese Christians. But he knew that the vast majority of the Chinese were neither Manichaeans nor Buddhists. So once he was in power, he made every effort to ingratiate himself with the powers that be. So he kind of dispensed with his Buddhism and became a Confucianist. Now, I need to explain that a little bit. You see, in China, the official ideology of the state, ever since the time of Christ, ever since the Han Dynasty, over 2,000 years ago, the official ideology of the Chinese state was Confucianism. And under Confucianism, all the highest positions in the government were held by Confucian scholars. In Chinese history, it's called a scholar gentleman, a Chunzu. And a scholar gentleman was somebody who received this training in all the classics of Confucian literature, was a Confucian scholar, and positions in the government, in the bureaucracy, were based on how well you did on tests and your skills and your knowledge of Confucianism. And so, now, being a scholar gentleman was often hereditary. You know, scholar gentlemen wanted their kids, their sons, to be scholar gentlemen. But it wasn't necessarily a closed caste. In other words, if you could be a peasant or a merchant, but if you got that Confucian education and you passed the tests and got a job in the Chinese government, wham bam, you're a scholar gentleman. So it was always open up to new talent, and recruited bright young men from the lower classes to join their ranks. Now, Hong Wu knew that he would never be successful establishing the Ming, or brilliant dynasty as he called it, unless he had the scholar gentleman on his side. So he became a Confucianist, and he maintained the system that had been around since the 8th century. It's this bureaucratic system where Confucian scholars are the ones who fill up the ranks of the bureaucracy. And it was a system that worked. It was a system, a bureaucratic system that had been around since the 8th century A.D., since the Tang Dynasty, and it had always been an effective system. And it's the way it worked, was just real briefly, was that in the Chinese government, there were 2 tracks you could follow, and these tracks were separate. And you could either go a military route and be a warrior and an officer and rise up the ranks of the Chinese military. So the military was here. That was on one side. And then on the other side, you could go a civilian route and become a tax collector or a government official, or be in the legal system. So there was a civilian track and a military track, and they didn't cross over. Now, to keep track of both the civilian and the military track, you had an accounting track. It was called the censorate, and this censorate was like the 3rd branch of the Chinese bureaucracy. It was its job to make sure that everybody was accountable. So if you were a civilian, it had a civilian job, or if you had a military job, you had to be subject to audits, and the censorate would come in and make sure that you were doing your job. Now, not so much in the military, but in the civilian and the censorate, you had to be a scholar gentleman. You had to have that Confucian training in order to rise up the ranks of the bureaucracy, and even to get a job. You had to even get a job, you had to do this very competitive testing. All the young men who wanted a job in the Chinese government had to go through extensive testing and very, very thorough examination, and had to go through years of education and training before they could even get to the point where they could take the test. So it was a very exhausting procedure. But once you passed the test, then you could get a job in the Chinese government. And all the ideology and the teaching and the morals of the scholar gentleman all was traced back to the teachings of the 5th century BC philosopher Confucius. Hongwu did some things. He won by converting to Confucianism and embracing Confucian religion. Well, it really wasn't a religion; it's more like a way of life, because Confucius didn't really talk about theology that much. He wasn't a theologian in any way, but it's a way of life. So he adopted Confucianism, and he ingratiated himself with a scholar gentleman. But he also established he wasn't averse to using threats and force and coercion to get his way. So one way he did secure his position was, yes, he would execute you if you disagree with him. He ordered many executions. He was very bloodthirsty. That's how sometimes some sources describe him. If anybody got in his way, he had them taken care of. So he ruled with an iron fist. Now you have to remember, one reason he was able to do that was because in the Chinese Confucian ideology, the emperor is the son of heaven. He is the son of God. Now they don't have the idea of God. Heaven for the Chinese is where all the gods live, so it's a kind of a collective thing. And so the emperor is the son of the gods. He's a divine figure. He's worthy of reverence. So once he established himself as an emperor, he could order people to be executed, and no questions were asked, because he was a divine figure. He was the son of heaven. All right. So now one thing that Hongwu did was that, probably knowing that he came from a peasant background, he knew that he had to do something to elevate his status and position and to win reverence. And so he made sure that when he at Peking, Beijing and Peking are the same word for the same city. At Peking or Beijing, he began building this great palace. It's known as the Forbidden City, and it was called the Forbidden City because it was like a combination temple/palace. I mean, and in the Forbidden City, only special people were allowed to even enter the city. That's why it was called the Forbidden City. You couldn't just walk in. You had to be invited by the emperor. And in the Forbidden City, everything was done according to ritual. We talked about this when we talked about Louis XIV at Versailles. It's the same principle. If you create a system where everything is focused on kind of reverencing and worshiping the emperor, where you have all these rituals and all these exercises and all these this kind of liturgy that you follow, and everybody's expected to follow, it creates a certain amount of awe and reverence for the person who's the object of all this adoration. So the emperor was like a divine figure, and in the Forbidden City there was all these rituals. And like, for example, everybody who came in front of the emperor, you had to get down on all fours and put your head on the floor, and you couldn't even look at the emperor until he gave you permission. So in fact, when European traders came to China, they were told, you have to get on all fours, put your head on the floor, and not even look at the emperor until he lets you look at it. I mean, basically, everybody was expected to worship the emperor, even if they were foreigners, to kind of honor him as being this reverential figure. And Hongwu really focused in on that. And under the Ming Dynasty, there had always been that aspect before, but that continued under Hongwu, that element. Question?
What if they didn't?
Well, you got in trouble. Hongwu would kill you. They didn't mess around. You could be executed by the order of the emperor. All he had to do was snap his fingers and he was dead. That's how much power he had. Now one thing that happened, another thing about the under the Ming Dynasty was that the Chinese became more and more kind of indifferent to the rest of the world. See, in the Chinese worldview at this time, they believed that the only real human beings were Chinese. Like, everybody else was like a subhuman barbarian. So if you weren't Chinese, you were just kind of like there. You were kind of like a monkey. You were kind of a lesser form of human. And they called the ruler of China was the ruler of the Middle Kingdom. In Chinese traditional way of looking at the world, you have the land of the gods, heaven. You have the land of the dead, which is below. So up above you have heaven. Up below you have the land of the dead. And in the middle is earth, where human beings live. And the ruler of the world, not just China, but the ruler of the world was the Chinese emperor. He was a ruler of all human beings. Of course, the only human beings that matter were Chinese, right? So that's how they looked at the world. And just to give you an example of this kind of mentality. The Chinese, in terms of technology in the 15th century, they were leaps and bounds above everybody else. They had, for example, they had the compass. The compass was invented by the Chinese, and which is very good for sea travel. You know, when you're on the open seas, knowing which way to go is a really important thing to know. So the compass was invented by the Chinese, and they also had a thing called the astrolabe. It was a device where you could look at it and figure out your position based on where the stars were in the sky. And the Chinese had invented these navigational tools, and the Chinese fleet, the Chinese ships, they were called junks. They weren't junks. It's junk. That's just the name of it. They were some of the best ships in all the world. Now, in 1418. The Ming Emperor, sent out a great admiral named Zheng He, and they built this huge fleet, and they had all these, they had all this great technology, these great ships, but this, you would think, well, they have all these great ships, they have all this technology, why don't they use that to establish trade routes and explore new lands and enrich themselves? They didn't do that. The purpose of this great voyage by Zheng He was not to establish trade routes, not to discover new lands. It was the ship would go all over. It went to Indonesia. It even went to East Africa. It sailed all over the Eastern Pacific, and it sailed all over the Indian Ocean. But the purpose of the fleet was to impress, so that other subject peoples would see the greatness and the glory of the Ming Emperor. And every state, when this big, huge fleet came in, every state in Indonesia, they quickly said, we recognize the Chinese Emperor as the greatest ruler of the world. I mean, you got this huge fleet coming at you, you're going to be like, yeah, of course, you're the greatest, you know. So the purpose of the fleet was not to trade or new lands. It was basically built to impress everybody about how great China was, how great the Ming Dynasty was, how wonderful they were. And it succeeded. And the funny thing was that after this fleet had finished its grand voyage, sailing through the Indian Ocean and visiting all these crazy places and seeing the world and establishing the greatness of the Ming Dynasty ruler, after it had done all this, they disbanded the fleet, and that was the end of it. They had accomplished what they wanted to do. They had established the greatness of the Ming Dynasty. They didn't pursue it. They didn't establish trade routes. They didn't establish anything. They didn't try to conquer anything. They didn't care about conquering anybody. Who wants to conquer Indonesia when your country is the only country that matters? Who wants to conquer a bunch of apes? You know, who cares? They're subhuman barbarians. So they didn't care. Now, one reason why the Chinese took this attitude was that in Confucian, the way of Confucius, the way of looking at the world, anybody who makes money or works with their hands is dirty. In other words, the only person that matters are bureaucrats. They're the only people. If you work for the government, you're somebody. I mean, if it doesn't have to be the central government, any kind of service to the people. If you're a government worker, you're awesome. You're a scholar gentleman. You're working for the good of the world. You're wonderful in every way. But if you are a merchant or a craftsman or a peasant, anybody who has to get down and dirty and work with something, then you are considered of lesser social status. So the Chinese they needed trade. Yes, they needed trade, and trade and manufacturing were a part of their culture, but it was viewed as being for lesser people, lesser social status. So there really wasn't a focus on obtaining new trade routes, or because those kinds of activities were seen as for the lower classes. They were not valued as much as being scholar gentlemen and serving his mighty emperor in this whatever. Anyway, now the thing about the Ming Dynasty was the thing about all the Chinese dynasties in general was that they suffered from a similar problem that we observed with the Ottoman Empire, in the sense that as time went on, the emperors got more and more incompetent. And there was a reason for that. The way the Chinese system worked was that every emperor, just like every Ottoman sultan, would have many, many wives. And any one of those wives could produce the next emperor. And usually an emperor might have 300, 400 wives. But he always had just maybe one or two of them that he liked more than anybody else. But the emperor would designate his favorite wife, her child would be designated as the crown prince, the heir in waiting. And that woman, who was the mother of the future emperor, was known as the Dowager Empress. And she had very much great power because she was the mother of the next emperor. Now, you can imagine that among the 300, 400 women who lived in the harem, that there was a lot of competition. Now, just like with the Ottoman Sultan, since any one of those women could be the mother of the next emperor of China, it was very important that those women have no access to men. So these women were kept secluded from the whole rest of the world. The Forbidden City, where we mentioned, included the harem of the emperor. And now, men are useful for some things. You need people to, fan and open things and lift. So these women needed men to do some heavy work for them. To bathe them and to give them massages. So what they do is they have castrated men. They're eunuchs. So every in the empire, in the Forbidden City, the only men you'd find in the harem would be castrated men. They were castrated as babies. So they were raised unable to have children, of course. Now, so what happened is that these, this was not exactly the kind of great environment to live in, where if you're a young man growing up in a harem with, all these women are competing to see which one of their boys will be the next emperor, and you're only male, you don't see your dad ever because he's the emperor and he's got 400 wives and 1,000 kids or whatever. He's busy doing other things. So basically, your only friends you had were eunuchs. Now, eunuchs did not get any kind of... Eunuchs were trained to be servants, so they could give massages, they could use a fan, they could carry luggage. I mean, that's all they were good for. That's what they were trained to be. They were trained to be servants. But what often happened is that emperors, growing up in this kind of atmosphere, they came to see their eunuchs as their only friends, as their father figures. So often what happened as time went on is that emperors would become to rely more and more on their eunuchs when it came for advice in government. And so, but these eunuchs didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know anything about government. So a lot of times eunuchs, their idea of government was that, well, we need to build more pleasure palaces so we can have fun. So over time you had these emperors who were not even focused on actual governing, and they were more interested in just having a good time and hanging out with the eunuchs. And the eunuchs were having a good time. Meanwhile, the government is kind of left to its own devices. Now, the Chinese government was built in such a way that it was very centralized. Power was concentrated in the people at the top. So if the people at the top are eunuchs who don't know diddly squat about government, then the whole system is going to suffer. So you're going to have scholar gentlemen who, imagine how that would have to feel. You're a scholar gentleman, you dedicate your life to training, and then you got some guy with no testicles telling you what to do. Who had no training or anything. But that's how it worked. And it had to be very frustrating for a scholar gentleman. So over time, you see that these dynasties, and you think that they'd learn, but over time, every dynasty would decline, and the emperors would get increasingly more and more weak and indecisive and more focused on pleasure than actually governing China. And so all it would usually take for these dynasties to fall would be some kind of disaster. See, in the Chinese way of looking at the world, the emperor is the son of heaven. So if the emperor is a true emperor, then the gods will bless China with harvests and prosperity and peace. So whenever something really bad happens, or a series of bad things happen, then that gets people thinking, okay, maybe this emperor has lost the mandate of heaven. Maybe this emperor no longer has the blessing of the gods, and maybe we need a new emperor who is a true son of the gods, a true emperor who has the mandate of heaven. So whenever bad things happen, that's when things started rebellions and uprisings began across China. Now, in the case of the Ming Dynasty, what really hurt them was not so much natural disasters, but some some embarrassing losses. In the early 17th century, they went to war against Japan over influence and control in Korea. And the Japanese armies won some big victories over the Chinese. And that got the ball rolling because in China, you see the emperor, foreigners are supposed to be subhuman, right? So if the Chinese emperor is losing to subhuman barbarians, there must be something wrong with that emperor. He must have lost the mandate of heaven. So these losses to the Japanese in the early 17th century, that begat the ball rolling, began people questioning whether or not the Ming Dynasty really had what it took, whether they had the mandate of heaven. Now, so that started uprisings and problems for the Ming Dynasty. But what really brought the Ming Dynasty finally down was a foreign invasion. And the invaders were people called the Manchu. Now, Manchuria was located to the north of China, to the northeast of China, in the steppes. And Manchus were, a steppe is a big, like, high plains. You may have seen the movie High Plains Drifter with, think of a big high, like think of the vistas in that movie, kind of big open plains, kind of high desert, and that's what a steppe is. And it can be very cold in the wintertime. Now, Manchuria was a place where people who lived on the steppe, they were nomads. They lived in tents, they raised cattle, and not so much cattle, but sheep for the most part, and they lived on their horses. And the Manchus were a nomadic steppe people. And they spoke what we call an Altaic language. That includes Manchu, Mongol, Turk. The Turkish languages are Altaic. It also includes Korean and Japanese. It's like a branch of Indo-European. Altaic languages are related languages. And the Manchu lived on the steppe, and they were horsemen. And now the thing about horsemen, when they find a good leader, they can be really powerful. They find the thing about the steppe horsemen is that they're great warriors. They live for fighting, and if they can be united under a strong leader, if you can get all the Manchu tribes on the same page, then they can become a powerful force. And so the Manchu tribes united, and they saw that China was weak and divided under weak leadership, and they invaded in 1644, and the Manchus conquered China. They took over Beijing. And that was the end of the Ming Dynasty. Question?
Did they put forth a good candidate?
Excuse me?
Did they put forth a good candidate?
Did they put forth a good candidate?
The Manchurians.
Oh yeah, the Manchurians. Yeah. They ended up having a really good dynasty. Yeah.
It's a stupid joke.
Oh, Manchurian Candidate. Yeah, I get it. Anybody ever seen the Manchurian Candidate with Frank Sinatra?
Yeah.
Oh, you've seen it obviously, but it's a great movie if you ever have a chance. Take me a while to get there.
Does the Great Wall existed during this time, or is that afterwards?
Oh, the Great Wall it was an ongoing building construction. It dates back to like the 200 BC, but it was built.
Okay, that was the World History 1 class.
Yeah, but they still have the Great Wall. Yeah, it was kept in good order.
They just went around it.
They just crossed it. Yeah, they beat it. They got over, started invading. Now the thing about the Manchu though is that when they conquered China, it took me a while. When they conquered China, they adopted Chinese culture as their own, and so the Manchu ruler became a Chinese emperor, and they pretty much kept the system that had been in place for centuries. They maintained that system. The only difference they made was that under the new dynasty, the most important positions in the government, let's say the highest military positions, were reserved and monopolized by Manchus or Manchu families. So, but the whole rest of the system, so the lower positions, the bureaucracy, continued to be filled by ethnic Chinese. But the highest positions were reserved for Manchu families or people of Manchu blood. But the Manchu fully adopted Chinese culture as their own. They spoke Chinese, they adopted Chinese traditions. So even though they came from the steppe, they adopted Chinese culture as their own. They were assimilated to a certain degree. Now, the greatest Manchu ruler was Kang Shi. You can see his dates there. And So he would have been roughly the contemporary of like Louis XIV and Peter the Great. And if you compare Russia and France to China, there was no comparison. China was, under Kangxi, China was the largest, most prosperous empire in the world in the 17th century. And it was under Kangxi's leadership that Manchu armies began to really expand their empire. For example, and there were in Central Asia, there were a Turkish people called the Uyghurs, and they were Muslims. And this region was conquered by the Chinese in the late 17th century. Now, today there's a big issue in China because a lot of the Uyghurs, they're different ethnically from the Chinese. A lot of Uyghurs want to be independent. And some Uyghurs have even embraced radical Islam and have joined Al Qaeda. But the one reason why there is the continued problem for China, because this is a fairly recent conquest. The conquest of these Turkish Muslim peoples was something that only happened several hundred years ago. Well, that's short, in Chinese history times. Now, another thing they did was that the Manchu dynasty conquered Tibet. Now, the Tibetans they're Buddhists, and they have their own culture and their own. They've been an independent state since the 7th, 8th century A.D. But Tibet was conquered by the Chinese and made part of Greater China under the Manchu dynasty, under Kangxi. And today, there's people in Tibet who want to see Tibet independent again. But Tibet, like Urgistan, Tibet is something that was just recently conquered. Another area, Taiwan, the island of Formosa or Taiwan, is just off the coast of South China. This had never been part of China. In fact, the inhabitants there were more related to the people of Polynesia than they were to Chinese. And the Dutch had actually established outposts on Formosa or Taiwan. But in the 17th century, the Chinese didn't like the Dutch there, and it was too close to China. So the Chinese conquered Tibet, expelled the Dutch, and then began to colonize Taiwan with Chinese. Now today, after the communist takeover in China, some of the Chinese who didn't like the communists moved to Taiwan, and today Taiwan's an independent country. But the Chinese believe that Taiwan belongs to them, dating back to its conquest that occurred and its colonization that occurred back in the 17th and 18th centuries. So the expansion of the Mongol Empire, not the Mongol, the Manchu Empire at this time kind of has created problems for China that continue to this day. Question?
So I talked about Tibet, though. Didn't they send the military in there in 1950s or 60s or something?
Yes, there was after World War II and during,
was a separate government.
separatist movement in Tibet to win its independence, and the Chinese communists sent forces in to reclaim it.
Oh, okay, so that wasn't, they were separate and they just conquered it. It was just basically,
It was kind of a reconquest of something that they conquered back in the 17th century.
Okay.
Now under the you see under the Manchu this idea that you have a dynasty that's wanting to preserve traditions, but things are always changing, and it was true with the Manchu. They changed China by conquering these new areas, Urgistan, Tibet, colonizing Taiwan. They were growing Chinese influence, so China was changing, but the emphasis in their brain was, let's focus on what makes China great. Let's focus on our traditions and our Confucianism. But China was subjected to a lot of change at this time. It was in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, for example, that all kinds of new crops entered into China. And a lot of these were introduced by European traders. Like I said, the Chinese didn't really like Europeans at all. They kind of considered them to be barbarians. But one thing they did bring to China that the Chinese liked was gold and silver. Some of that gold and silver from the New World, there was a direct route from Mexico to the Philippines to China. In fact, Manila in the Philippines, which was under Spanish rule, became a great city because it was the major point of contact between bringing gold and silver from the New World and bringing it and trading it with China, because there was a demand for silk Chinese tea. These were in big demand. Chinese porcelain. And so European traders wanted these goods, and so they used American New World gold and silver. And the Japanese, I mean, the Chinese were eager to accept this gold and silver because gold and silver were not in large quantities in China. So they were precious metals. So the Chinese would exchange their porcelain, their tea, their silk for European gold and silver. But the European traders also introduced all kinds of new crops to China, like corn, Indian, maize, Indian corn from Mexico was introduced. The sweet potato. Question.
I thought read somewhere that they already had yams, but when they were brought sweet potatoes.
Yeah,
they
they
were
were
like,
yams. There's different types of yams, but the potato and new yams were introduced to Japan, to China, through this trade.
okay.
And also peanuts. How many times when you think Chinese food, you think peanuts were only introduced to China in this time period, in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. It became, and over time it became part of the diet. But the result of all this, these new foods, the potato, corn, Indian corn, and peanuts, what they did was it created all kinds of new food and new nutrition, and this really buttressed up the population of China. The Chinese population just really zoomed. It just went through the roof in this time period because these new foods brought new nutrition. See, in China, Confucian belief system, the Chinese traditional belief system was that the more kids you had, the more the merrier. The Chinese never really had a beast of burden, so the main beast of burden was having lots of kids, work on the farm, especially in a culture in the south of China where they raise rice. Rice is a very labor-intensive product, and so it was considered a blessing to have lots of kids because kids would mean you'd have more work on the farm, more work and more labor. So in China, having lots of kids was a blessing. So people were encouraged to have lots of kids, and now that they had corn, peanuts, and potatoes, those kids were getting fed better and less likely to die of malnutrition or die of some kind of childhood disease. So that meant that the population, its demographics just shot through the roof. The population really grew dramatically. Now, population growth actually can be something within certain limits. It's good for the economy. And it is generally believed that the Chinese economy under the period in the 18th century especially was very strong because population growth was driving demand, and you had a thriving trade. The introduction of gold and silver by European merchants got a money economy really rolling in China, using gold and silver as currency, and this really promoted Chinese economic growth and population growth. So China was really in the 18th century probably the largest, most populous state in all the world, especially under the early Manchu. Now, as we see, when we start talking about 19th century China, that's when the Manchu dynasty really started to hit the skids and went through its own dynastic cycle, and that would eventually result in by the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century, with the collapse of the Manchu dynasty. But we'll talk about that in a later lecture. All right. Now what I want to do is talk about Japan. Now, Japan is another one of the great states of East Asia. Get this map to work. Well, these are some maps of Japan, but they're not really helping me. That's to change the site. But anyway, Japan, of course, is located just to the west off the coast of China, and Japan they're an Altaic people. Their language is related to Manchu and Mongol. Probably the current inhabitants of Japan probably colonized Japan. They migrated there probably about 400, 500 BC. And Japan had a very interesting system in, let's say, the 14th century when we start here. In Japan, the Japanese islands were united by their belief that the emperor of Japan was descended from the sun goddess, that the emperor of Japan was a divine figure. Now, Japan had always previously been under a lot of influence from China, so many people would say that the kind of the elevated position of the Japanese emperor owed a lot to the influence of Chinese culture on Japanese culture. So the emperor was a uniting figure. All the Japanese islands recognized the emperor as their divine ruler, and he was the emperor was descended from the sun goddess. And to this day, what's the emblem on the Japanese flag?
Sun.
The rising sun. Because for the Japanese, they equated being Japanese with love and loyalty to the emperor, because he was divine. Now,
That's what that is? I just thought it was a big red dot, yeah.
no, it's a rising sun.
The World War II one's more prevalent. Has the what do you call it, the stripes in there.
Yeah, it's the rising sun, because the sun goddess.
That makes sense. I mean,
The
I
sun
like
goddess created the islands of Japan. She dipped her spear into the water, and when the spear drops fell, the islands of Japan were formed. That's the tradition they tell. Anyway, but anyway, now Japan though was really, even though the emperor was officially the ruler of all Japan, that's not how it really worked. Instead, Japan was divided up into it's kind of like feudalism. Japan was divided up into different principalities, and each principality was ruled by a daimyo. You could probably, if you had to translate daimyo, you could translate as duke or count, like what we give to European aristocrats. The daimyo was the local prince, the local duke or feudal ruler of a local region. So every region of Japan was ruled by a daimyo. Now, every daimyo had under his control hereditary warriors, and they were called samurai. Samurai were men who were from their youth were trained in the bow and in the sword and how to fight on horseback. And they were I got a picture of a samurai, and it was a hereditary position. If your father was a samurai, you were a samurai. So every daimyo had these hereditary samurai under his control, and the loyalty that a samurai had to his daimyo was passed down from generation to generation. Now, at the top of the food chain, all the daimyo recognized a supreme warlord called the shogun. And the shogun was the man who had the most samurai under his control. And all the other daimyo looked to the shogun as their leader. And so the real military power was in the hands of the shogun. The emperor was basically just a ceremonial position. The emperor had his court, the emperor lived in his palace. The emperor mainly did religious activities. The emperor was kind of like the high priest of the Japanese traditional religion Shinto, which we'll get to in a moment. A lot of the things that the emperor did were ceremonial in nature. He had no real political power. Real power was in the hands of the shogun, the commander-in-chief, the supreme military commander. Now, from about the 14th century all the way up until about 1467, the position of shogun was held by a single clan, the Ashikaga clan. And they were the ones who monopolized the position of the shogun. Now, in 1467, the Ashikaga shogun collapsed. They lost the support of the daimyo. And this started a period of history known as the period of warring states in Japanese history. It runs from about 1467 to 1600. And what happened at this time was that you had all these different daimyo with their armies of samurai competing with one another, fighting with one another in order to see who would be the shogun, who would be the supreme overlord. So it was like a contest, a military contest, like a civil war among the Japanese to determine who would be the next emperor. Now that would be a really great reality show. Who will be the next emperor? But anyway, now, the thing that happened, though, in the 16th century was that, remember the age of exploration's going on, right? So you got all these Europeans showing up. And the Europeans, they like to trade, right? They say, hey, we got these things called guns. We'll sell them to you. We'll sell you the guns. You give us whatever you got. So all of a sudden, they got these guns. And with guns, they realized, with guns, you don't have to go through years of training with the bow. All you have to do is learn how to shoot the gun, and you're pretty good at it. So all these daimyo said, okay, if I just get a bunch of peasants and give them guns, I got an army, right? So all these daimyo, they trade with the Europeans, get guns, use the guns, train their peasants on how to use the guns, and then build their own armies. So warfare got a lot more complex. With now you had gunpowder and guns being involved in these battles. So being a samurai didn't mean anything as much anymore, because anybody who could fight with a gun and who could be trained in the gun, a peasant could become a warrior and fight in the armies of the daimyo. Now believe it or not, the guy who finally kind of brought an end to these wars was a peasant, a son of a peasant. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi. He supposedly was, I don't know if you can tell from this picture here, but supposedly people called him Dogface. Supposedly he was really ugly. He had this, he was a warrior from his youth, and I think he had a bunch of scars on his face, but he was a mean son of a gun. He was real tough, but he was able to raise his own army of his own army of soldiers using guns, and he was able to defeat all of his rivals, and by 1590 he was in charge. He had established himself as the shogun and the ruler of all Japan, just by diplomacy and military skill. One of these days I'm going to actually read a book on him. Rather than a textbook treatment of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, I should actually read a full-length biography, because he sounds like a pretty interesting character. Question?
The guns that they got, they were American or just European?
They're mainly European. See, America wasn't around. It was mainly
Flintlock.
Spanish and Portuguese and French and English. And a lot of times, what they do also is they would bring in, to train their guys in how to use the guns. They would bring in Europeans to actually train them. They'd bring in European experts, often European mercenaries, to come in. Like, they could be English, they could be French, they could be Spanish. They bring in these European mercenaries to actually train their armies on how to use the guns and train them in tactics. So you have a lot of foreigners around, right? Now Toyotomi Hideyoshi was the one who got the idea of trying to unite all the Japanese by conquering a bunch of land in Korea. He wanted to create a greater Japan. So he wanted to conquer parts of Korea and settle it with Japanese. So he's trying to unite all these various Japanese groups by fighting this war of conquest in Korea. And he was the one who started these wars in Korea that were very embarrassing for the Chinese government. That's one reason why the Ming Dynasty really lost a lot of credibility. It had to do with the wars that were inaugurated by Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Now, see, the thing about him was that when he died in 1598, he held the loyalty of his troops by the force of his personality. And once he died, he was unable to establish a dynasty. So what happened instead was that a man by the name of Tokugawa Ieyasu. Now, Tokugawa Ieyasu had been like a lieutenant, like a right-hand man to Toyotomi Hideyoshi. And he was also a man of aristocratic blood. So he had that going for him. But, so following the death of Hideyoshi, there was a more civil war, but eventually it would be Tokugawa Ieyasu. Here he is right here. He would be the one who would eventually defeat all his rivals, and he, unlike Hideyoshi, he would establish a dynasty of shoguns to rule over Japan all the way until 1868. So it would be Tokugawa Ieyasu who would finally end the wars, and he would set up a new system for governing Japan that was deeply rooted in the past to provide order and peace for Japan. Well, we've gone for quite a long time here, so I will stop. So why don't we take a quick break here for about a couple of minutes, and then we'll finish up Japan. All right, so now let's talk about what did Tokugawa Ieyasu do to kind of end the instability, create order, and create a strong dynasty that would last almost 300 years. Well, one of the first things he did is he realized that you couldn't have all these foreigners and their guns coming to Japan. So one of the first things he ordered was that he shut off Japan from the rest of the world. He closed all the ports in all the cities. So Japan would have no contact with any foreigners, ever. Now, they did allow the Dutch to come in and trade and have a port. So the Dutch, only the Dutch. And the reason why they had the Dutch come in is because they believed that the Dutch only cared about money, therefore they wouldn't try to introduce any foreign ideas like Christianity to them. So, and to this day in Japan, the word for foreign, any Western foreign thing, is called Dutch. So every foreigner in Japan, any European who goes to Japan will be called Dutch, because that became the word for foreigner, European, Dutch, because they only allowed the Dutch to trade with them, but on very limited terms, very limited terms. So they shut off themselves from the outside world because they didn't want evil influences, as they saw, like unstable influences like guns coming in. All right, so that was one of the first things he did, was shut off Japan from the outside world. Second of all, he made being a samurai a hereditary position. He froze the number of samurai. And every daimyo who was loyal was assigned a certain number of samurai, right? So only the samurai were a very limited number. Every daimyo had his own samurai. And another thing about this that he did was that he made it illegal to own weapons of any kind unless you were a samurai. So nobody could own, it became against the law to own a gun if you were not a samurai. The only people who could have any kind of weapons were samurai, and they were a hereditary class. Now, the samurai were trained as warriors, but because of the actions of Tokugawa, there wasn't any wars to fight. I mean, they couldn't go conquer outside people because they didn't have contact with the outside world. And once order was established, there wasn't any wars to be fought on Japanese soil. So what do you do with all these guys who are trained as warriors, but there's no wars to fight? Well, you make them into bureaucrats. So what happened is that the samurai they adopted the whole, even though they weren't Confucianists per se, they adopted the scholar gentleman persona. So samurai, these hereditary samurai, were trained to be bureaucrats, to be officials working for the local daimyo or working for the shogun. So they were trained as bureaucrats. Now, they still, as a point of honor, were trained in the ancient arts of warfare. And they all came to practice a very certain austere form of Buddhism called Zen Buddhism. You see, in Japan, many of the Japanese, all of the Japanese had converted to Buddhism, but they had adapted it to their own unique culture. Now, you see, in Japan, you have ancestor worship, and in Japan it's called Shinto. And the Japanese believe that they are descended from deities that inhabit natural phenomena. So mountains and rivers and forests are all inhabited by these spirits, these Shinto spirits. And the Japanese people believe that these spirits are their ancestors. Like the most powerful natural force in all the world is the sun, right? So the emperor is descended from the sun. And other people might be descended from a mountain or a forest or a lake. But part of the religion of natural religion of the Japanese was to honor these deities through traditional cults, traditional work prayers and sacrifices. And but Buddhism, as we already saw when we talked about the White Lotus cult, Buddhism can be adapted. Mahayana Buddhism can be adapted to in different cultures. So they could be Buddhists, but also follow their traditional Shinto religion. Now, among the Japanese samurai, Zen Buddhism is it's very physically training. You learn how to physically control your body. And being trained as warriors, it was important to have that kind of control over your natural functions, over eating, and it's very austere. By that I mean you voluntarily deny yourself many things to make you to allow you to have more self-control. So Zen Buddhism became part of the culture and the training of these samurai. So they were kind of a mixture of Buddhism and Confucianism. They were scholar gentlemen, bureaucrats, but they're also Zen Buddhists, practicing this very self-controlled form of Buddhism. And so they were the governing class. The samurai became like the elite governing class of Japan. Now, another thing that Ieyasu figured out was that that Christianity being introduced by foreigners was disruptive. So it was decided early on that there would be no Christianity in Japan. And so the government of the shogun made it a point to find out and root out Christians and have them executed. See, in the 16th and 17th century, well, mainly in the 16th century, Protestant and Catholic missionaries had made a lot of progress, and thousands of Japanese were converting to Christianity. Some Protestant, the majority of them were Catholic. So the Jesuits, Francis Xavier was a Jesuit missionary, and the Jesuits were the most active of all in proselytizing, in evangelism, and getting Japanese to convert to Christianity. But this was unacceptable to the Japanese government. So eventually, many Christians were rooted up and executed. They had to deny their faith or be executed. So it's estimated that over the course of a number of years, over decades, about 30,000 Japanese Christians were executed by the shogunate. And for the most part, most Japanese just didn't accept it, and that was the end of that. But the reasoning was that Christianity represented a dangerous foreign influence that needed to be exterminated. Now, actually, it's interesting. The neighbor to the Japanese neighbor to the east, Korea, had a very similar history to Japan. Koreans are related to Japanese. Korean is an Altaic language, like Japanese is an Altaic language. The Koreans had an emperor who was held at worship and revered like a god. He was called the Magikan. I didn't have that up there. But anyway, he was the ruler. And you also had a class of scholar gentlemen trained in Confucian training to be the bureaucracy. So they had adopted much of Chinese culture as their own, even though they were Koreans. And they were also Buddhists. They had also embraced Buddhism and linked it to, they had a religion that was very similar to Shinto, and that they saw spirits of the world, or natural spirits, as their ancestors. So Korean and Japanese history are very much similar. They had similar cultural phenomena. And the Joseon dynasty that came to power in 1392, they decided to go the same route as the Japanese and shutting off their kingdom from all outside influence. Traditionally, the Korean emperor was a vassal of the Chinese emperor, in the sense that the Koreans recognized the Chinese as their superior and paid tribute to them. But Korea did not have any kind of contact other than with the Chinese, and they shut themselves off from foreign contact as much as possible. In fact, when Europeans began to refer to the Korean kingdom as the hermit kingdom, hermit is isolated, because they kept to themselves. So both Korea and Japan, when having to deal with all these Europeans showing up wanting to trade, they both reacted in the same way by shutting their kingdoms off from as much as possible from foreign contact. And in both cases, and it wasn't until the late 19th century that in both cases the foreigners had to impose themselves and forcibly open up these countries to European trade. In the case of Japan, it was the Americans who forcibly opened Japan to trade in 1855. All right, we have just a couple minutes, and what I want to do now is talk about a little bit about India. We're kind of moving west here. We talked about China, we talked about Japan. Let's talk about India. And if you took World History 1, this might sound familiar to you. If you look at the history of India, India is sometimes called the subcontinent. It's in South Asia, and it's separated from Asia by, you ever heard of the Himalayas? The mountains, where what's that big, where Yeti lives? But the Himalayas, you see, are this big, huge mountain range that divide Central Asia from the Indian subcontinent. Now, historically in Japan, what happens is that people from the steppes of Asia, people from Central Asia, that big, huge steppe. Tribes and peoples from steppes of Asia will cross over the Himalayas into the Indian subcontinent and conquer it. That is the first time that happened is when the Aryans, Indo-Europeans, people from Central Asia, crossed over and conquered and settled in India and brought their language with them. That's why Indian is an Indo-European language related to French and German and English, just like Iranian is. They used to call all Indo-European languages Aryan, but Hitler did a little number on that because he identified the Aryans as the super race, and after that, after his debacle, nobody wanted to call themselves an Aryan anymore. So now we use the much less poetic phrase Indo-European to describe peoples that inhabit the region from the British Isles all the way to India. Just like Altaic languages are all the people that in Central Turks, Mongols, and Manchus, and Japanese and Koreans. That's an Altaic family of languages. Indo-European is like French, German, Italian, Russian, Slavic, Iranian, Persian, and Indian. They're all Indo-European languages. All right. Now, what we see happening is that in this time period, the similar thing happened. Like, for example, in Timur the Lame, in the 14th century, Timur the Lame organized a bunch of tribesmen in Central Asia who were Turks, and he conquered much of northern India and created a vast empire. It didn't last very long. Following his death and the breakup of his empire, what happened is that the tribes that lived in the steppes of Asia kind of repositioned themselves and organized new confederations of tribes. It's like the Mongols. They were people of the steppe. They had horses, they had tents, they had herds. But if they found a good leader, they could organize themselves and create a pretty powerful state, because the more tribesmen they united, the bigger army they could put into the field. Now, what had happened, though, was that the introduction of guns kind of did a number on how successful steppe warriors could be. It's one thing to have a big army of horsemen and use them effectively, shooting bows and arrows from their horses. But once the gun was introduced, it kind of did a number on the effectiveness of this, because you can use a gun and kill a horse, right? And so that's why Timur the Lame was the last great steppe conqueror. He didn't have a successor because after him, basically, it was a lot harder for a steppe army to be successful now that guns had been introduced. But what started modern Indian history was when a group of tribes called the Uzbeks came together and formed a khanate, formed a state.
Your conference is scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
And thank you. And what this would do would cause a man by the name of Babur, who did not want to be ruled by the Uzbeks, to march his army south from Central Asia through Afghanistan into Pakistan and India, and start a whole new dynasty that would mark much of the history of modern India. All right, well, we ran out of time, but that's where we're going to pick things up, looking at Indian history on Tuesday.